And so without that gold standard, the elites can manipulate the money supply, and they created the financial matrix, the world's greatest form of control ever, because it gives you the illusion you're free while you're enslaved to money.
Thanks for plugging in to Rethinking the Dollar. I'm excited to bring today's guest, Mr. Orrin Woodward, New York Times bestselling author, as well as leadership expert, who discusses our current monetary policies through his latest work, The Financial Matrix. I'm sure you're going to find this to be a very educational as well as informative interview. I want to encourage you to click the subscribe button below for more RTD interviews. And also, I want to apologize for the quality of the video. I had internet troubles during this interview, but other than that, the message is quite clear. Enjoy. He's a New York Times bestselling author, leadership expert, as well as an entrepreneur. Today, he joins us to discuss the state of our economy as well as our monetary system. Orrin has made the top 20 Inc. magazine leadership list and has co-founded 2 successful leadership companies. Today, we'll dive into his latest work and uncover some of his research from his book called The Financial Matrix. So, Orrin, welcome to Rethinking the Dollar.
Thank you, Mike. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I appreciate you taking time to sit down to go over your work. And as I mentioned prior to this hitting record button, how I actually came about upon your work years ago, and how, from the leadership standpoint, how you've done a great job is as far as, dedicating your life to help others in the leadership realm. So I want to thank you for that, because you kind of steered me down the path where I'm heading now as far as trying to educate people. So I appreciate you making a commitment in your life to help others. So thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. So without further ado, let's dive into some RTD questions. What comes to mind when Orrin Woodward hear the words rethinking the dollar?
Well, when you reached out to me the first time and said rethinking the dollar and asked to talk, I thought rethinking the dollar. I mean, I'd almost define it as restoring the dollar. We go take a look at the dollar was based upon a thaler in Germany, and then the Spanish used the dollar, and it was a certain amount of gold and now and silver. And you take a look at it today, and now we're talking. We call it a dollar, but we've totally redefined what that means. We still use the same term, but what it means today is just digital debt or paper debt. And so we have something that used to be something of tangible value, a commodity, and now turned it into something with no tangible value. And it's literally either just paper or what we call fiat money, backed by nothing but the state force. And so when you said rethinking the dollar, it's like, yes, we need to just rethink the concept of value. We need to rethink the concept of what this medium of exchange is, because the way it's run right now has made liberty, all of not just America's, but the civilized world's freedoms are at risk, because we've surrendered the power to create what I call the philosopher's stone, to be able to create gold out of thin air, create what we say is value, and money is power. And so if we've surrendered the ability to give somebody the ability to create money out of nothing, then we've surrendered our freedoms. Right. And that is very important to me.
Right. Now, how important is it for Americans to begin understanding some of the basics as far as monetary history, as well as their own personal finances in general?
Well, if you take a look at the history of slavery in Southern slavery, it was against the law to teach slaves how to read, because they understood literacy led to knowledge, and knowledge led to, hey, I'm made in the image of God, and I cannot be enslaved by another fellow human being. And in the same sense, financial literacy, the slavery today is through monetary slavery. And so if you do not have financial literacy, it's like the old saying, those who cannot read, or those who will not read, are no better than those who cannot read. And so those who have no financial literacy are easily enslaved. In today's slavery, I mean, you take a look at a slave, whether it be Southern slavery or even over in Europe, slaves were coerced into it. You knew you were a slave because you were forced. I own you, therefore I own your production. Today, the financial matrix, the slavery of money matrix, is very interesting, because you're not coerced into your slavery, you're seduced into it.
Yeah, you're lured slowly and surely, yeah. Now, from a practical standpoint, how come you think it's never been suggested or brought up to be taught, as even as an elective in our school system? Not the primary subject, but just something as extra credit for our students.
Well, it's interesting, because not to get off into conspiracy too far, but it kind of like, just as the southern plantation owners wouldn't want to say, hey, let's teach all our slaves to read so they won't enjoy their slavery. Who pays for our school system?
Right.
The state. And how do they do it? Through printing fake money, fiat dollars. So why would they sit there, hey, let's teach the slaves, the money slaves, let's teach the people stuck in the financial matrix how that we've got them stuck.
Yeah.
It's like, you go into class today, you will learn about a physical slavery. You will learn about feudal slavery, the serfs.
Mm-hmm.
But they aren't going to teach you about the financial matrix slavery. Why? Because that's the one they're running right now. They'll tell you about the history of the past ones, but they're not going to enlighten people about the current one, because if they did that, there would be a rebellion. There would be changes, because education leads to change.
Right, right. Now, if Orrin Woodward was at the podium running for, or just, all cameras globally was tuned in to your channel and, listening to what you had to say, what would you say as far as the global state of the economy address? What all would it entail and why? Global economy.
If I was in America, I would say, please quit talking about Republican and Democrat, and let's talk about freedom and slavery. Let's talk about the difference between a money system based upon commodities, where people can generate wealth, and a money system based upon debt, where people are constantly running up a down escalator. It doesn't matter how fast you run, as long as you keep accumulating debt, the down escalator will outrun your ability to work.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I was standing in front, I'd say, until we take care of the money system, until we get rid of the debt money system, liberty is an illusion. It gets back to the movie The Matrix that I based this all upon. It's like, let me read it. It's just so powerful. He said, so Neo's looking for the financial matrix in this movie, and he says, and Morpheus answers, do you know what it is? The matrix, and I'll say the financial matrix, is everywhere. It's all around us, even in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. That financial matrix is the world that's been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. And so if I could stand as making a financial address, I'd say, kill the financial matrix and restore liberty to the world.
Wow, interesting. That was a great perspective there. Now, let's dive into the book. Since you got it right there, let's dive into it a little bit now. I guess, what made you decide to write The Financial Matrix, and how did it come about, and how did you land that title? I know it's from the movie, but how did all that come about right now in this particular time in history?
Well, it all started, I read a quote from Bertrand de Juvenile, and this, just as you kind of got started by traveling the world and seeing different currencies, this French political philosopher Bertrand de Juvenile said this, and it just rocked my world. He said, whoever does not wish to render history incomprehensible by departmentalizing it into political issues, economic and social issues, would perhaps take the view that it is in essence a battle of dominant wills, and I put in parentheses, the elites, fighting in every way they can for the material which is common to everything they construct, the human labor force, and I put in parentheses, masses. So in other words, the elites are constantly seeking to control the production of the masses. And so then I said, well, hold on a second. If Bertrand de Juvenile, if that statement is true, I've read thousands of history books. I should see this in history. So I started saying, well, if they're after the production of the world, well, let me see. I've read tons of economics books too, and I know in economics, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill said there's only 3 factors of all production: labor, land, and capital. Those are the only 3. So if there's truly these control things that Bertrand de Juvenile is saying, we should see it in labor, land, and capital. And so then I'm like, well, do I know of any system of control through labor? Well, yeah, I do. That's slavery. We read about that all the time. I own you. Mike, if I own you, then I own all your production, and I might give you just enough to keep you alive so you'll produce more for me tomorrow. I'm not saying it's a good system. It's a terrible system. But and I said, well, that's the physical matrix. So I call that the physical matrix. I own you, therefore I own your production. And that was thousands upon thousands of years that system was in existence. But it finally came crashing down when enough Christian influence came into Europe, and that said Christians cannot own other Christians, and it became very unpopular. So they said, so now imagine the elites like, all right, we can't use that physical matrix anymore. What can we do now? Well, he said, well, the next one of the 3 factors of production is land. Do we know of any system where the elites captured all the land and then forced well, let's not call them slaves anymore. Let's call them serfs. And so they captured all the land. And then if you, Mike, or me, Orrin, want to live on their land, all we have to do is surrender a portion of our productive capacity because we're using their land, and we get to be farmers on somebody else's land.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, all right, so we got the physical matrix. That's the feudal matrix. Now, okay, so far, 2 for 2. We got labor, land. And I said, well, eventually the feudal matrix fell. And how did it fall? When money, rethinking the dollar, when money, the capitalist society created, all of a sudden the serfs didn't have to stay on the land. They started, there was a saying in the Middle Ages called, in the city air, the serfs breathe free, the peasant breathes free. And so they went to the cities and they became bakers and butchers and candlestick makers. And they started trading this little silver, copper, gold, money, and they no longer needed the land, and the feudal matrix fell. And so then there was freedom. And if you take a look at from about 1500 to 1900 was the greatest productivity increase of the masses. People who had no aristocratic names exploded into wealth. There was the greatest increase of productive capacity and wealth for the masses that was ever seen for 400 years. But guess what happened at the turn of the 20th century? They finally knocked over the gold standard, which was the check that kept the elites from manipulating the money supply. And so without that gold standard, the elites can manipulate the money supply, and they created the financial matrix, the world's greatest form of control ever, because it gives you the illusion you're free while you're enslaved to money.
Wow. That's a great history lesson there. Now, you mentioned gold standard there. So as we got into the 20th century and the linkage or the redeemability of paper to metal, give us a little bit of the evolution of how that was all part of the plan, as far as, at least, we give you paper, you give us gold, and you can exchange anytime, and how over time that kind of dwindled away. Speak to that for me, please.
Yeah, so originally, all of the money was gold. There was no paper. Well, then the banks, the elite bankers said, if we can get them to understand that if we give them this banknote, and this banknote is backed by that certain amount of gold, then it's as good as gold, you'll hear it. That's, this banknote's as good as gold. And some of the banks were very honest, and if you had this banknote, people could convert it. Well, very quickly they figured out, hey, a lot of these people take this note and never do convert it into money. They just trade it to the next guy, and they trade it to the next guy. Nobody ever comes home and actually asks. When you buy a house, you eventually want to move into it. So that you kind of know you have it. But if you buy a piece of paper and put a certain amount of gold and you get this paper, you just keep trading the paper. And the banks figured out most people never come back and ask for that. So they came up with this great concept called fractional reserve banking. That's where it started. And I'll give you an analogy of it. Fractional reserve banking is a system where the same dollar is loaned out to multiple people. It'd be like if I have $10,000. Mike, would you like to loan $10,000? Here you go. Here's $10,000. I give you a note and keep the gold over here. Then the next guy comes and says, oh, you'd like $10,000? I give you a note backed by the same gold. I mean, how can 2 notes backed by the same gold? I mean, how do 2 people own the exact same dollar? That doesn't make, or the same gold. Well, here's the analogy is, imagine if you wanted to have a motorcycle, but your wife said you cannot drive motorcycles. But your wife works on Saturday mornings. And so you're like, I'll buy your motorcycle, Orrin, but I can only use it on Saturday. Could you keep it at your house in your garage and just let me use it every Saturday? I'm like, sure. $5,000 for the motorcycle. You give me $5,000, and every Saturday you come over and drive it. Well, here I am sitting there. If I was a banker and fractional reserve motorcycling, I would sit there and say, wow, this motorcycle's just sitting there the other 6 days of the week. I'll sell that motorcycle to somebody else whose wife doesn't want them. I put it in the paper. If your wife doesn't want you to drive, I will store the bike and I'll loan it out. You can have it any day but Saturday. Right. And next thing you know, I sell the bike 7 times to 7 different owners. All of them think they own because I gave a piece of paper that says the title. Now, what would you call me if I did that? You'd say that's fraud. That's illegitimate. You can't sell the same property to 7 separate people.
Right.
And then I would say, well, the banking system does it, but not to 7 people. They do right now. It's at 10%, which means they sell the same gold through pieces of paper to 10 separate people. Now, it's worse than that today because there isn't even any gold backing today.
Yeah.
But at least originally, it was backed by gold, but they would represent 10 different notes on the same dollar. So they 10 times the money supply through fraud. Today, it's even worse because now, after 1900, for 400 years, there was a battle where they tried to break the gold standard. And society won for 400 years, and that's how all this wealth was created. Eventually, they got central banks in every city, so in every nation. And so for America, for example, the Federal Reserve kicked in 1913. After that date, they can literally print notes backed by nothing. It's not even backed by any gold. So and then that note becomes something that the other banks, fractional reserve banking, on top of paper. And so it's unlimited how much money they can create. And that was the end of the masses' rise. And since then, it's been a slow degradation of the wealth of society.
Right. And so the wealth has been concentrated in the hands of a small few and at the expense of the majority. Now,
let's do that again, one more time. So then let's see if that's what I just described. Let's see if that fits. Bertrand de Juvenile, writing in 1940. He said, in essence, it's a battle of the dominant wills, the elites, fighting in every way they can for the material which is common to everything they construct, the human labor force. In a capitalist society, he who controls the money controls the people.
Wow. Yeah. Interesting. So that, I mean, we can clearly see the problem with that whole concept and our model there. And it was all by design, of course, because it took, several, decades to come into full bloom. And so here we are now, 21st century, going through a lot of turbulence in various markets globally. And so just, side note, what's your take on the Fed rate hike yesterday?
My take is, it's amazing how much time and effort is spent by everybody trying to predict the Fed rate.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine, it's the only thing here, we claim we live in a free enterprise system. Can you imagine the federal government announcing the price for all cars? Can you imagine the federal government announcing interest rate? All that is the price of money.
Mm-hmm.
It's the price of money, like the money today versus the money next year. There's an interest of that. The interest rate should be set by the market. It should be people, just as the price of a hamburger is set by the competition. There ought to be competition in banking, and the interest rate shouldn't even be in their hands. So the fact that here, Alan Greenspan laughed. I mean, I read his book, and he was talking, the communist system try to control everything. Yet then he turns around, and he's controlling the number one thing, because he who controls the money controls, I call it fool's gold. And he who controls the fool's gold controls the fools.
Yeah. Woo! Interesting. That's yeah.
So
now,
what do I think about it? I think we need to get the control of prices out of the government's hands, because then whoever controls the government controls the people.
Right. Good point. So we see from a macro point of view the entire problem. Let's get into some personal solutions for individuals to begin to take back their personal liberties or whatnot. Now, towards the end of your book, you get into the Warren Buffett $1 billion lessons. You covered a lot of good concepts in there. Can you give us a rundown of what's that's about, and give us some examples of whatnot?
Absolutely. Well, Warren Buffett, started with nothing. He went to college and started studying under Benjamin Graham, who was very interested in the stock market, a professor. And so, starting with nothing, he built it up. Today, he's big and he works with the state, the government, etc. But how he started originally with two simple principles: eliminate debt at all costs and invest in yourself. Those were his two big principles. If you take a look at what did Warren Buffett do, he eliminated debt and expenses. Like anything, like some people, live in a big house. And he's like, man, I'll live in an average house and I'll take that money and I'll invest it, have it start working for me. So he eliminated debt. And then he said the number one investment that you can, think about, this is Warren Buffett. He's got a ton of pretty good investments.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he said the number one investment is invest in yourself. Warren Buffett reads anywhere from 4 to 6 hours every day. And most people are like, I don't have time to read 4 to 6 hours. Yet that same person will look at me and tell me that, and is watching TV for 3 or 4 hours, watching a movie for another 2 hours. And I'm like, no, it's not. Don't tell me that you don't have time to be successful. Just tell me you don't prioritize success. Let's be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And so those two principles, I read that, back in mid-1990s. And I remember thinking, now Warren Buffett's a lot wealthier than he was then, but even then I'm thinking, well, this guy's got a lot more success than I have. I'm going to start investing in myself. And we talked about financial literacy. That's a great start. Rethinking the dollar, Mike, what you're doing is you're creating a movement. You're recognizing that, man, if we don't have financial literacy, the whole system is rigged. You watch TV for 3-4 hours. How did they say, oh, well, it's free? I didn't pay for that. Well, now with cable, you do pay for it. But they have these ads, and these ads say, Mike, you can buy this and live the American dream. Just sign here, and for the next 5 years, we're going to take a certain amount out of your check. Well, if that was the only one, maybe you could survive. But then you did that over here for your house, and you did that over here for your car. You don't actually own your car anymore. You lease it, because 3/4 of the people lease their cars. So that you just get to pay the depreciation on your car. And so the next thing you know, you wake up, you're like, I own nothing, yet I have to work my whole life. And what is the definition of a slave? It's someone who owns nothing but has to work for somebody else.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Now, you referred to Sam Walton in terms of building assets. Let's get into that a little bit.
Sam Walton, if you were to say, now I know that some people look at Walmart today and issues, and I'm not defending that.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm telling you is Sam Walton in 1952 was a guy with very little money. He might have had $100,000 total net worth, and he took on giants. In 1952, there were 4 companies that opened up discounting stores. You had Woolco brand. You had Dayton Hudson started Target,
mm-hmm.
and you had Kmart. All of those were backed by billionaires, pretty big brands.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have this little guy, Sam Walton, that did 90% of the original investment in his first Walmart. If you were a betting person, who would you bet on? Kmart, the Kresge fortune, Dayton Hudson starts Target, Woolco. These are multi-billionaires. And here's this little guy that has a dream and says, I'm going to build a store, make it successful. He ran Ben Franklin 5 and Dime, so he had some experience in the retail trade, but he had no money. He should not have been able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yet he created a brand, built that asset, and created a duplicatable pattern. He said, I'm going to go into the smaller markets where my billionaire friends aren't going. And because they're like, oh, that's not even a big enough market for us. He said, perfect. I'll go into markets where they're not competing, and I'll make such effective and efficient stores. I'll build an asset. And he built it so big. I remember first starting to hear about him in the early 1980s. He still wasn't even west of the Mississippi at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he was building an empire. He had a duplicatable pattern. And by the time the big boys realized that they had a competitor, it was too late. And he was just gobbling up market share. And so it's literally a David and Goliath story. And you, as anybody who listens to this video, if you are not eliminating expenses, get yourself out of the financial matrix. Do not continue to be a serf in the monetary system. Get yourself debt-free, but in the process, also go on offense. We talk about defense, offense, and understanding the playing field. Rethinking the dollar is focused on what's the playing field, what is money, and how does it affect us. And so, but from a personal level, play defense, get out of debt personally, and then take some of the money that you're saving from not pouring it all into the money pit and start investing in yourself, understand financial literacy, and start to build a business asset. That's what Lori and I did. Lori and I were broke kids. We had $32,000 in debt outside of our mortgage.
Mm-hmm.
I'm driving a Chevette as a fully qualified engineer. Then I went and sold that and bought a truck that I couldn't afford, and I'm paying payments on this truck I can't afford. Then Lori announces that we're pregnant, and I'm like, man, we're broke, both of us working, her an accountant, me an engineer. And I'm thinking, what turn did I miss? I'm working 60 hours a week. I'm getting my master's degree from the #2 business school. What turn did I miss here?
Yeah.
And when I started studying the entrepreneurs like Sam Walton, the investors like Warren Buffett, I realized nobody ever taught me this. I had all this education, but everybody educated me to be part of the financial matrix, not to break free from it.
All right. Orrin Woodward, thank you for sitting down with me today and giving us an inside look rather to the book, The Financial Matrix. Can you give the audience, those who may not be familiar with your work, a chance? Where can they find your work, and how can they get a copy and things like that?
Absolutely. My blog is Orrin, Orrin Woodward, OrrinWoodwardBlog.com. And that's WOODWARD. So OrrinWoodwardBlog, blog.com. So, and that from there you can see all the articles, everything we've talked about today. I've got different articles on it. Get people thinking. I reference all the sources there because, again, I give all that away for free. Why? Because we need, just as you're doing, Mike, and I appreciate what you're doing because you're doing a service for society. You're helping educate the masses so that they can understand how to free themselves from the financial matrix.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I look forward to continue to follow your blog as well as other things you have going on in the leadership realm as well. So thanks for sitting down with us.
You bet. God bless you.
All right.
Well, this concludes my discussion with Orrin Woodward. Hope you found it to be very informative. If you're interested in hearing more of Orrin's thought on the dollar, as well as a few geopolitical events, feel free to become an RTD Interview Extra subscriber, where you get a chance to get additional video footage from our conversation. And also, scroll down below, leave us a comment. I would love to hear your thoughts on this interview. And if you felt this was very informative, feel free to share it with those that might be interested as well. Looking forward to bringing you more interviews. Thanks.